She stood amidst the rubble, staring in disbelief at the destroyed wall. Behind her, the HOA chairman grinned, smug and victorious. He claimed it violated some rule, but she knew this was personal. In her hand, a single document could change everything. What would she do with it? What happened next will shock even the most seasoned lawyers. But let's start from the beginning. It was a Wednesday morning like any other for Sarah Thompson, a 34-year-old graphic designer from the quiet suburb of Westbrook. But as she pulled into her driveway, something immediately caught her eye, a massive pile of rubble where her retaining wall had once stood. That wall hadn't just been a structure, it had been a feature of her property, an aesthetic touch that gave her home charm and security. Her breath caught. "What the hell is this?" she muttered, stepping out of the car, her pulse already quickening. Her eyes scanned the scene in disbelief. The maintenance crew, their trucks still parked nearby, were loading up their tools, clearly done with their work. They had just demolished part of her yard, without warning. As she walked toward the site, her stomach churned. Frank Jacobs, the HOA president, was standing by, his expression as insufferable as ever. His presence alone made her blood boil. "This was unauthorized." Sarah's voice trembled with a mix of disbelief and fury. "You can't just tear down a wall like this." Frank didn't flinch. In fact, he almost seemed amused. "Oh, I can actually. The HOA voted to have the wall removed due to safety concerns." "Safety concerns?" Sarah repeated, incredulous. "What are you talking about?" Frank barely made eye contact, casually shrugging his shoulders. "Your wall didn't meet the new HOA standards. You'll have to rebuild it at your own cost. Shouldn't be a big deal." The words hung in the air like a slap to the face. Sarah felt a surge of anger rising in her chest. How dare they tear down something so personal, something she had worked hard for, without a shred of warning or consideration? The HOA, led by Frank, had been pushing their weight around for years, making arbitrary decisions that hurt homeowners and disregarded their needs. This was just the latest example of their unchecked power. A bitter taste lingered in her mouth as she stood there staring at the destruction. This wasn't just about a wall. It was about control, power, and the utter disregard for the people they were supposed to represent. And as Sarah felt that frustration boil over, one thought stood out above all others. She wasn't going to let this slide. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. As the hours ticked by, the weight of what had happened only grew heavier. It wasn't just about the wall anymore. It was about the way the HOA had overstepped its boundaries, how they thought they could control every aspect of her life, even her own property. The idea that they could dictate what she could and couldn't do with her own home, something she had worked hard to make hers, gnawed at her with increasing intensity. By the time the evening settled in, Sarah's frustration was unbearable. Her thoughts raced. The anger burned through her veins, making it hard to think clearly. But she couldn't just sit there and stew in it. She needed answers. So she pulled out her laptop and, with a sense of determination, began digging into the HOA's records. Every click of the mouse felt like a small act of rebellion. Then, as the minutes dragged on, she found what she was looking for. Documents that proved the wall had been fully compliant with all local building regulations. It wasn't unsafe, as Frank had claimed. It wasn't an eyesore. There was no legitimate reason to tear it down. The wall had met all standards. And yet, here it was, destroyed without her consent, without warning. Her pulse quickened as she stared at the evidence on the screen, her hands trembling slightly. Frank had lied. The revelation hit her like a punch to the gut. The HOA didn't care about safety, about the residents they were supposed to protect. They only cared about control, about flexing their power over homeowners. The injustice of it all made her blood run cold. How dare they take something from her? something she had worked so hard for, something that was hers by right. But as she absorbed the full weight of what she had discovered, a shift occurred within her. This wasn't just about being wronged, it was about finding the power to fight back. This was the ammunition she needed. With that single discovery, everything changed. Her hatred for the HOA grew into something more: resolve. They had underestimated her, and now, armed with the truth, she would make them regret it. The next morning, Sarah walked into the HOA office with a fire in her eyes. The documents she had uncovered were clutched tightly in her hands, her proof, her weapon. She wasn't just going to let Frank get away with this. She had a mission now, to confront him and demand justice. She stormed straight into Frank's office, and the moment he looked up from his desk, she cut him off before he could speak. "You lied to me," Sarah said, her voice unwavering, the words cold as steel. Frank raised an eyebrow, but there was no amusement in his eyes, only a hint of irritation. "You had no right to tear down my wall," she continued, slamming the printouts of the permits, regulations, and meeting minutes onto his desk. The papers skidded across the surface with a sharp sound, the tension thickening in the room. "And I have the proof." Frank didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. He eyed the papers with a dismissive glance, not the least bit intimidated. "What are you talking about?" he asked, the words dripping with condescension. Sarah's jaw clenched, the anger bubbling up in her chest. "You said the wall was unsafe, but I've got everything right here. Building permits, the regulations, and even the meeting minutes that prove it was perfectly fine." Frank glanced at the documents again, then shrugged, his smirk never faltering. "So what? It's done now. You're going to have to pay for a new wall anyway." Sarah's pulse raced, but her voice didn't waver. "Not if I have anything to say about it." Her eyes locked onto his, unblinking. "You're going to rebuild that wall. On your dime." Her anger, once raw and seething, now sharpened into something more focused, something dangerous. She had come for a fight, and she wasn't going to back down. The more Frank dismissed her, the more determined she became. This wasn't just about the wall anymore. This was about standing up to the people who thought they could steamroll over her, control her life, and take what was hers without any consequences. With every word, she felt the weight of her resolve settle in. She had proof, she had the will, and now she had the fight. She wasn't going to let Frank or anyone else get away with it. Not this time. Sarah didn't stop. She filed an official complaint with the local council, backed by her evidence. She posted about the injustice online, and soon other homeowners began speaking out. They had all dealt with the HOA's heavy-handed tactics, and Sarah's fight became theirs. Weeks passed, and the HOA board was forced into an emergency meeting to address the public backlash. In the end, the HOA not only had to rebuild Sarah's wall, but they were also ordered to cover the costs of the damage and provide a formal apology. As Sarah stood in her yard, watching the new wall being built, a sense of pride washed over her. She had done it. She had used their own rules against them and come out on top. Frank, standing across the street, glared at her, but she didn't care. The justice she fought for had been restored. Flooded her as she realized she wasn't just the victim in this story. She was the one who had taken control and won.